No turbo tips. So now we're going to get into. We talked about the week before last cutters. Then we talked about rulers. So we're all into cutting and rulers, and we're trying to stick. I was kind of sticking to like this basic quilting idea in the absence of Becky, who likes to do like really fun, more interesting things than myself. One of the things that I thought kind of deserves some time of its own. I think I covered this a few months ago, got into this a little bit, but I was going to get a little bit more in depth into it, is patterns. One of the things you'll notice if you come to our shop is we don't sell a lot of patterns. We don't sell a lot of books. The reason for that, and here's my thinking on it, is that there's only so many different ways to put fabric together, and quilting has been around forever, so I think they've thought of most of those ways. And every new pattern or book, a lot of times, is just a new way to. It's just a new version of an old pattern. And there's lots, and with the proliferation of the internet, there is lots of options out there for patterns that you don't need to pay for. A lot of the fabric vendors that I use, that we buy our stuff from, have just libraries full of patterns. And so I wanted to kind of get into that today. Where I go when a collection of fabric comes in, and I'm like, I need to find a pattern for this. I like to just make stuff up from scratch. That's really what I do. If I'm making a quilt for myself, a lot of times I'll just throw something together myself that I like. I can't do that if I'm making a sample. Because what happens if I make a really cool quilt and hang it up? What's the first somebody comes in here and says,
Somebody wants that.
yes, they come in. Where's the pattern? Where's the kit for that quilt? And if I made it up off the top of my head, that means I'll have to write it down. And this is also going back to another point I want to get into so I have to write it down. And writing a quilt pattern down that you've just made from scratch is a pain in the butt. That's why I have the utmost respect for people that make patterns, that write them down so you can copy what they did. And that goes to, if the pattern was not distributed for free, I like to encourage people, don't copy patterns, don't share patterns. Designing and making patterns is a pain in the butt. And if the designer has said, please don't copy, do them a favor and pay for the pattern because they deserve it. And I'm going to show you some resources right now of a bunch of free patterns. And because they're free, I'll also encourage you to purchase and use the fabric from these vendors, because they've gone through the trouble. They compensate their pattern makers to get these patterns for free on their websites. And like I said, the reason I go out and look for patterns when I'm doing a sample is so that I don't have to write one up, because I know what the pain in the butt it is. Like I said, I love to just make something up from scratch, but for samples, I always go out and look. And so I thought today, I'm rambling at this point, but today I thought I would I'm going to show you a couple different websites that I go to when I'm looking for a pattern, and things that I consider, because when you're looking at a pattern, the other thing to keep in mind, one of our most popular patterns, there are a few patterns that we carry. Yellow Brick Road and Cheese and Crackers are two staples of quilting. And the Cheese and Crackers pattern is a hard sell if somebody looks at the picture on the package. It looks like a weird clown quilt thing. It really does. It's one of those patterns that when you see it, the picture on the pattern, nobody buys it. I make up a sample in any other colorway, it looks fantastic. So I want to get into that a little bit today too, is getting past the picture of the pattern and what to look at in the pattern when you start to think, how am I going to do this myself? So kind of in keeping along the lines of this idea of basic quilting, we're going to get into pattern selection at this point. Because we talked about cutters and rulers and how to cut your fabric. Now we're going to talk about where to get you the directions and how to work, make a quilt. And I'm not going to get into the basics on making the quilt, but now we're at the point, let's select a pattern. Let's look at how to get instructions, how to put stuff back together. So without further ado, let's go to my computer. See, I made my mouse super big for this so that I would, one of my favorites is Wyndham Fabrics. We carry Wyndham Fabrics here. They have and if you look across the top here, projects, free patterns. That is a fantastic resource. Wyndham has a huge resource of patterns. The other website I use a lot is Benartex. If you've been to our shop, you know that we have a lot of the Benartex basics. So we do a lot with their fabric. They also have a fantastic selection of free patterns. The other one that I like a lot of is going to be, I don't do as much with Michael Miller anymore, but they also have a fantastic library of patterns. So I would encourage you, we're going to stick to these basic three sites today, because, and also Blank is another one we use a lot, is not there, Blank Quilting. They do a lot, and we do a lot. Blank is a division of Jaftex, and we do a lot with Jaftex, like your Free Spirit and stuff. They do some great stuff. So those are the four sites that I use a lot. And once you start looking through these different sites, you'll notice that they have different styles to them. So when you're looking for a specific pattern, you might, a lot of times if I'm looking for a good panel pattern, I end up going to blank first. Pre-cuts, Michael Miller, each one kind of has a different flavor. So as you start to look at the different patterns, you can learn different stuff. So anyway, let's get into this. So those are going to be the 4 sites we're looking at today. These are the sites that I will go looking for free patterns. They're pretty clearly labeled. They had projects, free projects, which I've got opened under this tab here. No, not that tab. We'll go back a tab. So, and then, like I said, Wyndham, these are just pictures of all the projects you can do. And if you look down here on the bottom, there's like 73 pages of projects. When you look at these, so if you look at all these different patterns here, you've got lots of stuff to choose from. One of the things to keep in mind, so we're on page 9 here, which I want to remember that. I'm going to go back to page 1. Something that you'll run into a lot with free patterns as you're looking through these different sites. Like I'm looking at this and I love this Honey Donuts quilt. That looks really fun. So I'm going to say, let's do Honey Donuts. And if I highlight that, Honey Donuts pops right up. But if I go to download it, what I get is that. This is really common. So Honey Donuts is a fantastic pattern, but you'll notice there's no pattern there. The reason being is what happens a lot when you're looking at free patterns is if you go to View Collection, which is Espresso Yourself, notice up here it's not going to be available until November of 2022. So because the fabric is not available yet, the pattern hasn't been completely written. They do this a lot. They don't release the pattern until the fabric comes out a lot of times because this is just kind of a test pattern. They're still working out the details on it. So this one's not available until 2022. So you're not going to get a pattern. This pattern, all you're going to get is just the cut file. You're just going to see this is what it's going to take to make that. And this, for if you want to understand how things happen behind the scenes, if I liked this collection when the Wyndham rep was here, I would probably order all of this fabric here so that we could make this quilt. That a lot of times I order based on these projects. So what has happened is there's been a lot of fabric manufacturers that have done away with free patterns. And if you're a fabric manufacturer or sales rep out there and you're watching this, have free patterns. There are vendors that I don't do a lot of business with anymore because there's no free patterns. Free patterns makes it easy for me to decide what to order for the shop because like this Honey Donuts quilt, I could order all of this fabric here to make this quilt. And my job is easy. I just have to order those bolts. I have a project ready made. I don't have to think about it when it comes in, download the pattern, Bob's your uncle, and we're all happy. So if you're looking at patterns and you get a cut file, a lot of times that means that fabric line hasn't come out yet. So ignore it, wait till November, and it'll be available. But one of the patterns I wanted to look at is going to be, we're on page 8. This was kind of a fun one. I just wanted to start here. One of the things to keep in mind, so here's a great pattern. Look at that fun little birds in the woods thing. And I actually have that open over here. So I downloaded, and you just download the PDF, open the PDF up. And this is a great pattern. I mean, you've got a lot of fun stuff going on here. Again, you have to look past the colors on a lot of these because you're going to use your own fabric sometimes. Buy their fabric if you can find it, but if you've already got a bunch of fabric, you just want to make something, you've got to get past the colors. It's a very cute quilt. The reason I highlighted this is because something a lot of people overlook is, so you need all these fabrics. But that's not why I opened this pattern up. Look what comes with this pattern. If we scroll all the way down to the bottom, voila, look at that. All the applique pieces to make the bird. So if you're into applique and you like that cute little bird, you don't need to make this entire quilt. You can download this pattern and have all the applique for the bird. That's pretty simple applique. This would be a very easy digitizing project. Yeah. Something like this, I'm looking at this right now thinking to myself, we could digitize that bird fairly easily. But if you didn't want to, you just want to do some hand applique, that's included with this pattern. This is a free download. Download the PDF, print it off, and away you go. The other thing to look at with pattern, this is another issue, another reason I download, is look at all the fabric you need for this. So if I was ordering for this particular fabric, I wouldn't order this because look at all the SKUs. I might, but look at all the SKUs. You've got all that fabric. That's all the fabric you're going to need to make this. Now, consider this for a second. Maybe you don't need to have 6 different versions of flying geese. Maybe you just want 2 different versions of flying geese and you alternate the colors. If that's going to be the case, when you're looking at your fabric down here, you can adjust. Instead of buying all of these, you can cut it in half, double up what it calls for. Because if you'll notice, each of these flying geese pieces up here are all 3/8 of a yard. So anyway, when I'm looking at this pattern, so one of the things I was talking about is if you look across, you have all these different flying geese. Maybe you don't want to do that many flying geese. Maybe you just want to alternate one or the other, and you don't have all this pattern. So if you look down here, these are the colors. This is why when I'm looking at patterns and trying to decide what I'm going to do, I don't want to do all these fabrics, but I want to do a lot of this. So what I'm going to do is I look up here, and I see that these guys right here, all these 3/8 yards cuts, these are all your flying geese. So what I could do if I wanted to make use half as many colors, is double up a couple of these and use half as many fabrics. Does that make sense?
I follow you.
So when you come back up here, when you start putting it together, you'll have like 2 greens and 2 blues instead of all 4 of these, and you can alternate it. Something to consider. That's one of those things that when I'm looking at patterns, the amount of colors I'm seeing, you are not stuck to that, because we're using the pattern here. We're not looking at a kit. We just want to see what it's going to take to make that. Another good one, this is a very good example of the color issue. That is a beautiful quilt. I mean, if you look at that Super Stellar, that's a free download, 99 by 99. That's a huge quilt. Now, another thing to look at. So this is a huge quilt. Maybe you don't want a huge quilt. Maybe you just want a little wall hanging. So what you could do is just make the center portion of this and have a wall hanging, which is going to be a lot less work than the whole thing. The other reason that I have this is, again, look at all the colors involved in making this. Maybe we don't want to do all the colors. So maybe what we want to do is, instead of having all these colors, maybe we just want to repeat this portion here, because the way these go together, let's go down to the directions, because you have to know what you're looking at with directions. So if you look at your directions, this is how this is going together. You're making that unit, and then those 2 units get put together, and this becomes your square. This right here is the square that you're making. So when I look at that, I'm saying that's the main unit. So I'm going to end up making 4 of these to make that center star. Maybe I don't want to do all of these colors. Don't get me wrong, the colors are gorgeous in this, but I'm looking at it thinking I only want to have like a red and orange star. So what I could do when I'm planning this pattern out is just get the colors I need to make this square, and then make that square 4 times so that my star is just those colors. These are, like I said, these are things I look at when I'm looking at a pattern on how I'm going to make this be mine. And so this is your basic unit. This is walking you through how to make that basic unit. And now you can choose to, instead of doing all of the multiple colors, you can just do one of those colorways. And same thing down here. You're going to notice here's another basic unit that we're making. So when you look at, these are your basic units. And again, keep these units in mind. You don't have to use them just on this pattern. You can take these units and use them in other patterns and use them, lay them out differently. That's the beauty of quilting. But one of the things I like about a lot of these free patterns is you've got bits and pieces of different patterns that you can start to put together and put in your toolbox on how to make things. So if you look back at this pattern, you've got a bunch of those different color crosses right here. But you don't need all that color variation if you don't want it. And you don't have all that fabric. So instead of making all those different colors, the pattern walks you through how to make these guys right here. And it tells you finish size of 6x6, so you can actually do some fun stuff with that. But instead of making it in all the colors, make it in 2 colors or make it in 3 colors, and then alternate them appropriately. Same thing with this here. So when you're looking at a pattern, don't get stuck in the idea that, oh my gosh, I've got to have a bazillion colors and I've got to make this giant 99 by 99 quilt. I wouldn't make that quilt. It's too big. I'd get bored. But I'm looking at the different portions of it, and I can see these stars here. These upper stars here would make a fun quilt. These here would be interesting. So there's a lot in this particular pattern that I would find very useful. And the pattern itself is free. It's not going to cost you anything to download this. And download it, print it out, and then you can mark it up with your own pencil or pen with your own notes to make it into your quilt. But it's a fantastic jumping off point of something to make. So this is a real fun. I'm just looking at this pattern. There's all sorts of directions and all sorts of things you could do with that. That's very interesting. Okay, now we're going to move on to Benertex, another pattern site. We do a lot with Benertex. A lot of our basics here in the shop are Benertex. They have a lot of great free patterns, and I'm just going to go to their free pattern site. So you can see here they've got all sorts of stuff to choose from. I don't even remember what I opened up. Alfred's Friends. Okay, here's another. This is a great one. So this is actually a great pattern because this one uses a panel. So this is going to be your main panel here. Now what's interesting, when I looked at this, I looked at all this stuff here, yay. So like this side here, if you look here, this is actually a stripe. You're not piecing that. What's interesting about this particular quilt is there is 5 pieces of fabric in it. So there's not a lot there. But one of the things I did like about it is I looked at it and I looked at the dimensions of this panel. And you've got what looks like 3 separate scenes. So say that you've got a really cool embroidery project that you've made that you don't know what you're going to do with it. You made these really cool, that winter scene that everybody's working on here. You've got these really cool winter scenes and you don't want to make the huge quilt that it's calling for. What you could do, instead of using this pattern and getting the colorful cats panel, you could make your own panel out of a few different embroidered scenes, and as long as those scenes, when they were stitched together, you could trim it up to a 22.5 by 40.5, which is clearly stated right here in the middle. If you can trim up that piece to that size, you can substitute in for the panel like an embroidery scene or something that you've done up yourself. Like say you've got this beautiful applique thing that you want to turn into a pattern, you want to turn into a quilt, but you're not sure how. This is it's got all the dimensions and everything you need to do that. You just put your scene together to make sure that it matches the panel dimensions here in the center. And then you can use this pattern to build everything out around it. So that's another way to use patterns. Like I said, a lot of panel patterns. You can do that with all sorts of them. Whenever you see a panel pattern, like I'm just going to pull this bad boy up. View download. We're going to pull this one up. This is another great. See, this has got an interesting center panel. Again, you've got a ton of fabric in here. What they're doing with it, I can't really tell why they've got some. Oh, because they're cutting a lot of that out to create this here. And I don't see any pieced blocks, but oh, there's the piece because I wasn't going all the way down. You've got all these crazy borders. But what's interesting about this is you've got this centerpiece that, again, if you look up here in the directions, we're going to cut that to 18.5 by 22.5. Because this panel, they're cutting the panel down and fussy cutting these squares out of it. Let me blow that up a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. So this panel here gets cut down to 18.5 by 22.5. So again, if you've got like an embroidery project or some sort of applique project that you've put together, you're trying to figure out what am I going to do with this, you can take this pattern and we see that this centerpiece here gets cut to 18.5 by 22.5. So as long as whatever you've made fits those dimensions, you can now use this pattern to create a wall hanging or a quilt with those stuff. And what they've done here is this patch panel. This is kind of fun because you can see here, they've been cut to 6.5 by 6.5 fussy cut squares. So that's this stuff up here, which is good, again, if you have, you've got some project or you've got a really neat pattern that you want to take advantage of. There's some really large prints that might match something you put in the middle that you could just cut 6.5-inch squares that aren't fussy cut to create that illusion. But again, you've got to on this particular one, I'm just looking at this, you have to get past the fabric. This has the fabric in this is a very specific theme to it, but you could really do some interesting stuff. Very simple, you're just throwing borders on, but where the work happens is going to be here in the middle. You could use that for different things that different projects you may have done. This one I really like. The reason I liked this one is this I thought of for the K Facet stuff that we just had come in, because one of the things about his fabric is if you look at it, it's ginormous. I'll use this one here as an example. So this fabric is a ginormous print. We said this earlier. You see how big that is compared to my hand? This is a huge print. So if I'm going to make full use of this, I've got to find something where I can cut something large enough to use this flower. Because if I cut this into 2.5-inch squares, as an example, 2.5-inch squares is about that big. So depending where I cut on this fabric, I might get black and white, I might get purple, I might get orange. It's going to be all over the map if I'm cutting small. So when I see this, I'm thinking to myself, I've got to cut a big, 8.5, 6, at least 6.5, 8.5, a fairly large square for whatever pattern I'm going to use for this, so that I can take advantage of this beautiful print. Because it's not going to do me any good to get a 1-inch strip out of this, because I'm going to lose all of this coolness here. So this pattern here, again, if you look at this, it's based on a panel. But those panels, what's really cool about this, gets cut into 18.5 by 16.5-inch rectangles. So these squares here, just to get an idea how big this quilt is, this is a 61 by 66. So these are 18.5-inch by 18.5 by 16.5-inch rectangles right here. So that would work really well for this fabric that came in, because an 18.5 by 16.5-inch rectangle, no matter where I cut it on this fabric, I don't have to fussy. I could fussy cut it to make sure this gets placed in the middle. But 18.5 by 16.5, that's a huge cut. That's going to look good no matter where I cut this. And if we look back at this pattern, in fact, I'm thinking we'll have to make this now. If you look back at this pattern, you'll notice that around those giant blocks, we're going to have a little piece of sashing. So I don't have to fussy cut this giant print now. And all I have to do is put a piece of black or something around that to really set it off. And this would look like a completely different quilt done up in this fabric that just came in. And what's nice about it too is fabric F, that outer border, what is that getting cut at? So we look at this. We're cutting 6.5 inch wide. So I'm looking at fabric F here. 6.5 inch wide fabrics with strips for that border. That is a huge border. And those 6.5 inch is really going to lend itself well to the rest of those large print fabrics that came in. We'll take advantage of those larger prints. These smaller units here, we'll probably just grab some basics off the shelf, like a black and some stuff that matches. But you can see where it would. Like I said, I'm looking at this pattern. I'm really thinking when we're done here, I'm probably going to print this off and actually make this with this fabric because I really think it would be cool. And you can really see it wouldn't look anything like this. It'll look totally different. But the measurements, the reason that I like the idea of this pattern is if I make it with different fabric, I can give you this pattern and all the measurements on how to cut everything will give you the effect that we come up with. So that's another thing I look at a lot when I'm picking out a pattern. Knowing the fabric that you're working with is going to determine, some of these different ideas about what we're looking at for a pattern. Michael Miller, if you ever see Michael Miller's fabric is very eclectic and all over the map, and they have some fantastic patterns. And I pulled one up that I thought was really cool. This one right here is a lot of fun, that chicken. But there's a lot to pick from here. This is a great kind of panel quilt. But like I said, this chicken I actually have pulled up because, we'll go back to that one, not that one, where are we at? This guy here. Because again, this is a free download. Again, like I said, support the vendors and the designers that are doing it because I think it's important that we make sure that...
Is that like applique?
Yep, it's an applique.
Oh, I love that.
And so here's the layout for it. And then down here is all of the pieces to make that applique. Again, it's a freebie. Download this, cut it out, and away you go. And this is, again, I think this would be a real fun digitizing project if I could actually see... This would be easy to digitize. If you have a Dream Machine or even a Stellaire would probably do this, or a Luminaire, you could digitize this very easily on the Design Center. You wouldn't need software because these are very clearly done. That's a 8.5 by 11 sheet, fits right on your scan sheet. You could scan these in, isolate, and the way he has these printed, isolate what you want for parts, and you could easily digitize this into an embroidery pattern. This would be a fun, easy pattern. But this is a free pattern. You can download it. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that's like I said. This is the Michael Miller pattern, and there we go, Michael Miller. But there's all sorts of fun patterns. This one here is kind of interesting. Again, that's more of a panel. A lot of panel ones, but I like panels as they give you options because you don't necessarily need to use panels. You can use a large scale print. What was the one I wanted? Why did I have this one? Oh, this one was good. This was another one I liked for the idea of using a large scale print because look at the size of these blocks in here. Those blocks. I'll just teach you how to read a pattern real quick. Where did I download that? Oh, here it is. So this is all the fabric that's in there. Again, I don't know that I would use all those fabrics because we have like that red, for example. This red here gets used. It gets used as your binding. That gold. Well, I'll talk about the blue and the gold. So this gold gets used around to frame some of your blocks and sort of this blue. But maybe you don't want to do all those different frames. You could do everything in a gold frame or everything in a blue frame or everything in a red frame. So red fabric. So you don't necessarily need to have all of these colors because when I'm looking at my pattern up here, I can see what it's being used for. And I would be all right with, I want to do everything up here and say that teal, I'm going to alternate the teal and the gold. So I don't need that red fabric. And so when I'm thinking about how I'm going to cut this, or I want to cut down on the number of colors just because I don't have that many to choose from, or I don't want to get that complicated, you can just look at a pattern and say, I'm not going to do all that. I'm going to combine, I'm just going to do two here, but I'm going to get rid of the red. So I'm going to get rid of the red and this black here. So all I would do is I'm going to replace it with the blue and the gold. I would combine when I'm looking at, so this pattern calls for a half yard. So say I wanted to combine the blue and the reds up here. All I would do when I'm cutting my fabric is just make sure put the 3/8 and the 1 5/8 together. That's 2 yards of one color, and that will take care of all my frames and my border. So that's something. But the reason I highlighted this pattern, now that I've bored you all to death, one of the reasons again that I highlighted it is I looked at these main squares, and I wanted to see how big they were. And those are that's going to be fabric B. See if you notice here, they're labeled fabric A, fabric B. So fabric B is what our blocks are made out of. So I'm going to come down here to fabric B, and it's telling me I'm going to cut those at 7.5 by 9.5. So again, if I don't want a fussy cut or I have a large scale print, I can just cut 7.5 by 9.5 inch squares instead of fussy cutting this panel to make to change this pattern to do something different with it. So what I am saying, now that I've, like I said, bored you all to death, this is a great one for all the colors. Look at all the colors at this particular quilt. Oh, where did it go? Look at all the colors in that quilt. You don't need all those colors. This heart design is really neat, but you could realistically, it would be a really fun quilt if you just did these first few hearts here all the way down. You don't need all those colors. So when I look at this, I would, just cut enough. Instead of thinking I'm going to do all this, just do half as much fabric, double it up, and then these hearts could you need less variation. I mean, granted, it's got a really cool effect, but that's what the reason I had that is just all those fabrics in there. And again, great little quilt, freebie. It's here. So here's the unicorns that just came in. This is a freebie from Blank Fabric. So this is going to be the kit that we're actually going to make up. This is going to be really cool with the fabric that we've got, because I ordered the fabric based on this, and there's the unicorn. Yes, that's a fantastic point Gene just brings up. On these hearts, that's another thing, I didn't even think of that when I was looking at it. On this heart quilt, that would lend itself really well to ombre type style fabrics, because you could use just two ombres and get that same gradation effect depending on where you're cutting where you're cutting your pieces out of the strip of the ombre. That would look fantastic with an ombre. That'd be a very interesting quilt. Again, I might have to save this one and put that on my to-do list, because we've got some cool ombres that would be great for that. And then here's the sparkle. Like I said, we bought that fabric came from Blank. It is this great pattern here. That's where our unicorn bicyclists are coming in, that I'm like, why do I have this fabric? But it's part of this kit. And this kit, honestly, I'm looking at this, you could do this with a lot of the panels we have in the shop. We'd have to just come up with different fabric. But there again, great little project. Where's those stars coming from? Is that yep, here, see, this is interesting. Those stars are actually applique. We'll probably, because I'm going to try and convince Brenda that she wants to make this, and I know how she feels about applique. So we'll probably have those stars digitized at some point, and maybe we'll make that like a download on our website for this pattern, and you can all be like, oh, look at that, a free download of the star. But we'll have this kit available here shortly, because the fabric just came in. But there again, this is a free kit from Blank, a free pattern. Here's this was another fun one I was just looking at. I don't know why I pulled this one up, but you all get the idea. You don't need to buy patterns. I mean, I'll sell you patterns if you want to buy them, but there are so many patterns out there right now. These are just the 4 sites that I get most of mine from, and there's a lot more out there. There's a lot of designers will have free patterns, and like I said, it's very important, if you have a pattern that you like, support the designers, support the companies that are doing it, because it's work. Making a pattern is a lot of work. I know it goes. I've made a couple. I know it goes into it. I'm thankful that these fabric companies do this so that you buy their fabric. So, like I said, it's important to buy their products so they can continue to do this. Like I said, there are companies I'm buying less fabric from now because I don't have free patterns to choose from for some of the collections that are coming in. And I just noticed this on the Blank. But like I said, one of the reasons I wanted to cover this is because we talked about cutting, we talked about rulers and cutting, and now you want to what are you going to make? And patterns are plentiful. Go and you can. A lot of times, I know Pinterest. I don't know if Pinterest is still a thing, but I've had people come in with like a picture off of Pinterest, help me make this. And what I would say is we can do that. A lot of times, follow that link. There's often a link to one of those projects that will have the pattern to do it. And honestly, if it's a $10 pattern and you really like the project, it's worth it. Because the work that goes into a lot of these, it's not easy. And if you find a pattern that you like, you can make it your own. A lot of times, I'll see a pattern I like and think I'm going to make changes X, Y, and Z, but I'll purchase the pattern before I do it to support the designers for putting that out there, for inspiring us, to help us do this. It's kind of a, I know it's patterns are it's hard to justify it sometimes as a frugal person. Danny knows what I'm talking about.
I'm frugal.
Frugal. It's like, oh, why am I going to pay for a piece of paper? It's not the paper. It's what went into it. And like I said, there's plenty of free ones out there. They're free, and most of them will say free for private use. You're not supposed to sell them. Which I've been to like quilt shows, and this is awful. I've been to quilt shows where some vendors will print off the patterns and like selling them for $1 a piece, and I'm like, really? What's the cost of printing? Like, really? But that's just something to keep in mind. Is there's plenty to choose from. There's some great books. What I've noticed, we've got some we do carry books in the shop, like the 3-yard quilt books. There are some great books for quick, easy patterns. Missouri Star Quilt does a great job with pre-cut patterns, which I could have got into here, but I didn't. You can see a lot of, there's these very scrappy quilts that are done a lot of times with pre-cuts. And again, when you look at that, look at the fabric requirements and think to yourself, I don't need 20 cuts of 20 different fabrics. I can do it with 10 different fabrics. It won't look as scrappy, but you'll still have a nice quilt. So when you look at patterns, really look at how they're made, look what's going into it. A lot of them are laid out. You can see the layout visually, and then you can kind of imagine in your head. Like I said, print them out. Get some crayons and get some pens and mark them up. Make them yours, and use it as kind of a jumping off point for projects. But that's what I want to get into. Is like I said, patterns. They're plentiful out there. And the 4 sites that I showed you, like I said, Wyndham Fabrics, Blank Textiles, Michael Miller, and Benartex are one of my 4 primary resources when I'm looking for patterns for samples in the store. And again, the reason being is we buy a lot of their fabric. Like I said, not so much with Michael Miller lately, but it is what it is. I haven't seen the rep forever. But it's a great service, and I would encourage you to, like, if you find free patterns, or you find patterns you like, support the designers and support the artists that make them, because without them, you're going to be left to your own devices. And like I said, I love just freestyle and quilt. It's a lot of fun, but I don't do it for samples because I hate trying to reproduce it. And that's one of the things. That's why I've like, if you come to the shop, you look in our front window. Eddie did a fantastic job with 2 quilts. I dread the day that somebody comes in and says, "Hey, do you have a kit for that?" Because Eddie did not write a single thing down when he made them.
I actually did for the second one,
yeah,
and then half of it's wrong. So.
Yeah, because it goes into it. And so they're fantastic, and a lot of times those quilts will throw up as inspiration on what you can do with fabric. I think the one Riley just made that we showed here earlier today, she used a pattern, she based that on a pattern, so we can do on one of the free patterns, so we can show you the pattern we started with and make the notes. I'll do that a lot of times, is have a pattern with a couple notes on it on what we did differently to get the quilt that we did. But like I said, support artists and support designers, because that's how we get this stuff. And like I said, I enjoy making my own stuff up, but to get to the point where I'm at, where I can just kind of look at stuff and make it up, I've done a lot of patterns. I've sat through and looked at, if you want to bring this up, like, I've made these type of quilts. So look at this unit here. I've had to make those. So I've made a bunch of those units. So now that I know that unit is now in my toolbox of things that I can use when I throw a quilt together. And that's why you want to have patterns. And if you're just starting out quilting, use patterns and learn different quilting units, and you can later get used to throwing those into other quilts and kind of combining things. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Shenanigans with Brent and Becky and Spirit. Thanks for joining. Like I said, sew on and be excellent to each other.